up? What's up? What's up? What's up? What's up? Welcome to Art of Advocacy live stream. We do this every Thursday. So first time joining us, then I just want to say special welcome to you. If you were here last week, awesome. Thank you so much for joining us again. By the way, this is what I need you to do. If you want to be notified when we're going live, we're trying to do 6 o'clock Eastern, but sometimes we change things up. That's what we do. But if you want to keep track, make sure you can follow us and all that jazz. Feel free to, what they say on YouTube, like smash that subscribe button and all that jazz, right? Make sure that you join up with us. So those who are out there watching, do me a favor, let me know where you are coming from. I'd love to know. Just say hello. Let us know what area of the country or the world you're in. Also, let us know if you're a teacher. Let us know what you do as far as your education, your professional experience. Love to know that as well. As always, feel free to get your questions ready because I have a special guest today. And once we get done with our session, we're going to leave some time for some Q&A for you as well. So if you have some thoughts, and you can always definitely put in any comments in the chat, any of that information, you could do that. That's awesome. So in just a moment, we are going to bring on my BFF. Dr. Sawsan Jabber is here with us today. And so we're really excited for today's topic. So before we get into that, this is what I want you to do. I'm going to read the bio, just a brief bio for Dr. Jabber, and then we'll bring her on just a moment. But shout out where you're from. I see Aaron is here. Thank you, Aaron, for joining us today. Let us know where you're from. Let's see. Aaron says she's from. I'm assuming that's a woman. So let me stop my biases there. Aaron is from Connecticut. So thank you so much for joining us. Anybody else that's out there, let us know. We're going to get started in just a moment. So let me read the bio here. Dr. Sawsan Jabber is a global educator for 20 plus years. She has held a variety of leadership positions both in the United States and abroad. Dr. Jabber is currently a high school English teacher at East Layton High School in Franklin Park. She founded Education Unfiltered Consultant. She works with schools around the country on curriculum mapping, strategic planning, custom tailoring, a social justice curriculum for schools, and anti-bias training. Dr. Jabber is a board director of Our Voice Academy. Shout out to Jenny and Our Voice Academy and everyone who was part of those cohorts. I happen to be fortunate enough to be a part of that as well. And she's charged with amplifying the voices of teachers of color to create more equity for students of color as well. She completed her PhD with a focus on inclusion and belonging for students from marginalized communities. All right, without further ado, we're going to bring on Dr. Sawsan Jabber. So, Sawsan, thank you so much for joining us today.
Hello. How are you?
I am good. It's good to see you. It's always good to see you. How are you doing?
You as well. Good. It's a crazy time of year. I think everything is happening, but we're doing well. Glad to be here with everybody again.
Yes.
Favorite podcast, everybody. It's my favorite podcast. This is what keeps me entertained in my long drive to work every single day. I'm listening to all the awesome guests that Sheldon brings on.
Well, I appreciate that, and it's always good to know someone is listening to the show because there's a lot of work that goes into that. So it's always good when someone says, "Hey, I listened to your show." So, and I know you do, and I definitely appreciate that, and I appreciate your time. It looks like you're at school. You're just finishing up for the day.
Yep. We're still here.
How did it go today?
Actually, it was really awesome. We have been today was the last day of Writers Week. And so we've been celebrating writers, and we have professional writers come in talking to our kids. We've got teacher writers who share their work. And then the last day is student writers. And I have to say today was the best day because we got to hear our students kind of really sharing their voices and just sharing themselves and parts of their stories with the rest of the school. And it's just really awesome. So this is one of my favorite times.
I love when you have a good day, that just makes what we do so much more meaningful. And sometimes we have rough days, sometimes we have good days, sometimes we have okay days. And with everything that we have going on in our politics and education and all these reforms and legislation that's being passed and all that stuff, it's great to have those good days. And let me just remind folks, if you are in education, if you are a teacher or principal, counsel, whatever your position is, take care of yourself, man. Mental health is very important these days. So now I read your bio, and that's what's on paper, but why don't you share a little bit, maybe a little bit more, or maybe something that you think folks that who do not know you should know about you?
I feel like I've been on your show so many times. Like people, if you're a listener of Sheldon's podcast, like I am, then you probably already know something about me. But I don't know. I feel like I'm definitely passionate about students and about the work that we do, and I'm definitely passionate about equity. I feel like I've been through school in this country from high school, from elementary school all the way through college, and was never really seen or understood by my teachers. And so I feel like it's become my life calling somehow in just a bunch of different spaces to really draw attention to my lived experience as a student and to try to kind of amplify and elevate and leverage those experiences to try to change the experiences of students in classrooms across the country and in our world in general. I feel like the key to disrupting the inequities in our country are our classrooms and our schools. That's where it's going to happen. And so I feel like that has somehow morphed into, if you asked me 20 years ago or 15 years ago what my future trajectory would look like as far as education was concerned, this definitely was not planned. But here's where I find myself, and I can't imagine myself doing anything different.
Can't imagine yourself doing anything different. Okay, well let's talk for a second, because I'm curious if there is a hobby that you're into. I mean, when you're not educating, when you're not thinking about school, what is something that Sawsan does?
Let's see. I'm a traveler. I love to travel. Whenever I get the opportunity, I'm out of here. So I love to learn about different cultures and really experience different places and kind of get the best of the world out there. There's so much to experience and learn from. And so that's one thing I do. I'm an English teacher, so I'm always reading. A nerd, if you ask my kids. So I'm constantly studying, reading, listening, attending workshops. Like I find myself in school. Although I have my doctorate, I am pretty sure that once things calm down, if they ever calm down, I'll probably pursue another degree, just because I find myself in school, and that's something that I feel. I know that's the face my kids.
Another degree? You got a PhD, you're done. You're supposed to be done. What else is there?
I love school. I feel like that's where I belong. I thrive there. I feel like it's one of the few times where I'm just doing me, and just kind of in that space and in that circle where you're able to like elevate yourself and expand your capacities and grow and around other people that have like interests. I just feel like that's where power is. And so I miss it. I miss being in school. I miss being in those spaces where I'm having critical conversations with people, over periods of time. And just, I try to attend as much professional development as I can, but it's not the same.
Wow.
So I'll probably end up in school again at some point. I don't know when, but that's probably in the future for me, in the stars.
Well, much love to you if you're thinking about going back to school. I thought about getting a JD at one point after I got my doctorate, and I was, not that I want to be into like be a lawyer or any of those kind of things. However, I love education as well, and I actually studied for the LSAT for a while. And eventually I just decided, I'm done with school. I can't go back to school anymore. I'm done. So, but shout out to you.
For now, maybe you'll change your mind, right? You never know.
Who knows? Shout out to Popsy. Thank you for joining us, Popsy. Good friend of mine. I'm glad she's here with us today. So what are you currently reading, Sawsan?
I just finished reading Street Data, and I just purchased Texture Teaching by Lorena German, and that's my next thing on the list. I try to stay on top of what good practices look like in social justice learning in the classroom, and kind of disruption looks like on a systemic level, because some of the work that I'm doing outside of my classroom and within my school is to look at equity work that's beyond cookie cutter equity work, I think, and then equity work too that is not so focused only on teachers in the classroom, but is more systems based and really disrupting. And then for my enjoyment, I'm reading Clint Smith as the word is passed, and I'm absolutely in love with his writing and in love with his work. And I think everybody should read it, because as much as I've read to try to fill in the gaps of what wasn't in the textbooks in my own education, he definitely brings forth so much new information, and not just brings forth so much new information from a historic perspective, but the writing is just so mesmerizing and so beautiful. And so highly recommended. Everybody should pick it up and read it.
I got to get my hands on that. I love Clint Smith and his work. So yeah, thank you for that recommendation. So let's get into today's topic. We are here leveraging the voices of students for social action. I think this is such a very important topic, but I want to get your take. Like, what made you want to discuss this? What was your motivation?
I think it was just my experiences in schools with teachers who are well-intentioned but still harming students in their work for equity. I think oftentimes when we're doing equity work, we consider ourselves experts, and we definitely are when it comes to maybe pedagogy and things like that. But no matter how learned you are about equity work, what often happens in schools is that teachers are doing equity work for students instead of alongside them, and for communities instead of alongside them. And so things like stereotypical representations end up what is being offered up to students as a form of a mirror. And I feel like that's much more harmful for students than not doing equity work at all, right? Because what you're doing is immersing students in false representations of themselves that have traumatized them. And through your instruction and through your, again, well-intentioned work, they're being re-traumatized by those things. And oftentimes kids, especially in a K through 12 setting, even myself as a college student, I think don't have the capacity, the knowledge, the developmental ability to really say to a teacher, I disagree with this, or this doesn't represent me, or this is incorrect, because developmentally all they want to really do is fit in, especially at K through 12 levels. And so what happens is that these students, from my experience and from my research, end up either like really just focusing on school and shutting down socially and emotionally, and just doing school well, or they start to develop this double consciousness and this duality where they're one person at home and another person in school that is more assimilated and fits in more. And oftentimes they become rebellious when that happens, because they know that they can't bring their school persona home and they can't bring their home persona to school. And so that creates tension with parents, and it creates a whole other set of problems for these kids in their lives, because they feel like those two personas can't ever converge. And we've seen, like, I think more than ever, especially with COVID, students kind of reacting to not feeling included and not belonging and not being understood in schools, fomenting in very unhealthy ways emotionally and with mental health in the long term. And so I feel like it's so super important for us to really get this work right, because the reality is, and even for my own kids, they're spending more time in school than they are at home most days, right? And so if they're going through school feeling very invisible, again, even with well-intentioned teachers who are misrepresenting them because they think that they know, but they don't actually know, it's just really, really detrimental to them in so many different ways. Their identity, they have identity crisis, and they go through life kind of building on that. I know for myself, the unlearning took a really long time for me to be able to name a lot of those things. It took a really long time, because nowhere along the lines of my career as a student, from K through college, did anybody ever have those conversations with me. And so when I was approached by a college professor with a novel that was supposed to be representative of me, but was a whole amalgamation of every stereotype you can imagine about Arab women, and she said, I want to know what you think. And she pointed me out in the classroom the day we were supposed to read the book. And I didn't have a response for her. I knew I was offended by the book. And so that's what I said. I said, this book offends me because I feel like it doesn't represent my experiences or the experiences of anybody that I know. But I missed opportunities to really plant seeds of doubts for classmates in my classroom, to understand that this book does not represent the experiences of Arab women, at least the majority of Arab women, right? And so I feel like that's where a lot of the disconnect happens in equity work, or what we think is equity work. And so what needs to happen is that there needs to be a collaboration between communities and schools in bringing the kids to the forefront and having their voice integrated in the work and making sure that they have a seat at the table so that we are doing what kids need and not what we think kids need.
I think I saw your daughter jumped in for a second here.
Okay,
want to say, want to say hello.
Hey,
That's
Van.
what's up. Hey, so and thank you for joining us, by the way. So, okay, you touched on something that really resonated with me because my son, for example, I remember when we would have parent-teacher conferences with his teacher. Like the teacher I knew how he was at home. But then when I would go to the parent-teacher conference and talk to the teachers, it was like a totally, like the stuff they would say about him, it was like a totally different person. I'm just like, who is this guy that you're talking about? Because I don't see this version of my son at all. So when you said, like a lot of our kids are basically being two different people. They're one way at home, maybe one way in the neighborhood, and then they're one way at school. And I think that can be a challenge because they have to at such an early age, they have to try to navigate two different worlds, if you will. What type of toll do you think that takes on kids when they're basically trying to operate on two different planes?
I mean, do they ever really come into loving who they are and like owning their identities, right? They're really seeing their plural and linguistic diversities and their cultural diversities and all of the other, things, the markers that make us diverse as assets, right? Because we're basically sending them the message that who you are isn't good enough to bring to school. We don't appreciate it. And so that's what kind of forces this sense of double consciousness to gives it birth, like it comes alive because of that, right? And so if we made kids feel like who you are is welcome, like we love, what you bring to the table, your diversity is something we need to celebrate and learn from, and we created those spaces, then kids wouldn't feel a need to have this sense of duality, right? And so it almost becomes permanent with a lot of people because they never have the opportunity to be who they are fully, right? And even in our adult situations, like how many of us are in school situations where, as a teacher of color, you're the minoritized, you're the minority among, in our demographic divide. And even as an educator, and how to name these things, you feel like you can't bring your whole self into an educational space with other academics, right? It doesn't stop. Because schools historically have been places where people have been like kind of forced to assimilate in order for them to be accepted. And that doesn't change on a professional level either.
Yeah, it doesn't stop once you become into the adulthood. If you go back to school and you become an educator and you've experienced this as a student, and then now you're experiencing a lot of these things as an adult. I mean, that makes total sense. Now, let's talk about, because I love when you submitted a video to the Leading Equity Virtual Summit back in 2021, and I had the opportunity to rewatch it before we got into today's topic, and I really enjoyed a lot of the content that you provided. One of the things that really stuck out to me was the idea of reframing the traditional classroom. So I kind of wanted to throw that out there to you. What do you mean by reframing the traditional classroom?
I always think about the TED Talk by Sir Ken Robinson. I don't know if you're familiar with it, where he talks about like how kids start out in kindergarten, and then as they progress through school, we kind of spirit murder them and stealing from I forgot her name right now because it's been such a long day, but spirit murdering kids, right? And their creativity and like what they're capable of doing. We kind of kill that along the way with our cookie cutter school. Like It's almost like a factory, and we put kids through this factory and we expect the output to all look the same. And so I think about that, and I think about how we've kind of really written curriculum and done school in ways that force kids to like not be in a lot of different ways. Like even as an English teacher, when I assign students, like, okay, we read a poem that's a dialogue between a Native American woman and a massage therapist. I want you to go home and write a dialogue poem about something that you feel really is important to you, and have a conversation through your poetry. The first question I get is, Dr. Jaber, how long does it have to be? Mm-hmm. And I'm like, it's your poem, as long as you want it to be. How many like words, that they want criteria that really kind of holds them to a very specific cookie cutter, right? And that's because that's what we've gotten them used to. The idea of the the canvas is blank and you can create whatever you want to create is really hard for kids, because all throughout their educational career, we've been giving them kind of the planned curriculum, the textbook, the 5-paragraph essay, like all of these kind of markers that are very, very standard, right? So that they can kind of do well on these standardized tests that are the measure for success in our current educational programs, which is flawed on so many levels, but that's a whole different conversation, right? So in reframing the traditional classroom, the kids do a lot of the driving, right? They do a lot of the driving. There's a lot of critical conversations. I don't see my students as, and I saw a tweet that if Ruby Bridges was old enough to experience it, then our kids are old enough to have these conversations about it, right? And so I kind of use that as my mantra with a lot of things. And I think that our kids are adults. They're budding adults. They're the ones that we're going to get older and they're going to take over, and we have to prepare them for that, right? And so part of that preparation is having them make decisions, having them be the drivers of what their education looks like, what's important to them, where do they see themselves taking the information that you give them, what is the information that you give them, how do we bring the world, and really dismantle the boundaries of classroom settings and bring the world into our classrooms. How do we have critical conversations? How do you have a dialogue, right? Today, kids are so immersed in their technology and kind of texting that sometimes even teaching them how to have a conversation face-to-face is something that we need to kind of unpack. And then when we're able to have the critical conversations, what matters to you? And what are the things that are really going to help you be successful out there? And so that's one of the things I tell my kids at the first day of school every year, right? If it doesn't make you a better person and doesn't prepare you for the real world, we're not learning it here. There's no need for me to teach you a simile or a metaphor or a rhetorical device if we're not going to talk about how really enhancing those tools helps you counter story tell, so that you're able to tell your own story and put it out into the world, as opposed to us leaving the platform for someone else to tell our story the way they see it, right? And so it becomes a skill that they own because they find it something that's powerful and not just something I have to memorize and regurgitate for a standardized test or a test. So and I remember when I was trained to be a teacher, we did the Wong's first 2 weeks of school, like don't smile until December, make sure you like hone in those procedures.
I remember that.
Yeah. And for me, it's the first 2 weeks of school is really just getting down to the core of who we are and unpacking who we are, so that students can see that I care about who they are and I want them to bring their whole selves to the classroom. And so we do tons of I know a lot of teachers do like bring 3 things to school. And so the kids will bring like their basketball and like their picture of their family and then their pet. And here's who I am. And that's not who kids are. It's really important for them to understand their positionality and unpack the intersections of their identities and really understand what those words mean, right? And so we spend a good first month of school really unpacking who they are, right? From a context of a social justice perspective and an equity context. We do a privilege game where they buy their own privileges and they understand that sometimes things we take for granted as certain groups of people are privileges that other people don't have. And so we understand that to name our privileges and understand how the questions I ask them are, who am I? How do I view myself? How does the world view me? And how do those two things kind of shape the way I view the world and the way I interact with it, right? Because we know that adolescents, children before a certain age, they're kind of immersed in a world, and we know it's a very, especially like in our current context, they're immersed in cartoons that are racist, Aladdin, Mulan. They're all have images that are single story stereotypes, and those images, and in addition to like what they see on the media, in addition to things that they're exposed to, the assimilation that happens in school, they're creating this invisible lens that they see through life through as adults. Except they don't know that that's happening, right? By the time they get to a certain age, all of a sudden they're wearing this pair of glasses and they're seeing the world through those glasses, and it filters everything that they see. And unless somewhere along their educational career, we're having conversations to help them name and unpack and unlearn a lot of those things that they were immersed in that created that invisible lens, then it becomes a permanent view that they see the world through. And so I always ask myself, like, if we look at, for example, so many of the high-profile court cases that are happening in our country now are race-based and kind of conversations that the world is having that are focused on inequities in our country. In all of those stories, if we want to take any one of them and unpack it, how many people were involved along the trajectory of a story that happens, right? Let's take George Floyd, for example, police officers, lawyers, courts, right? Reporters, like everybody who had anything to do with George Floyd's case from A to today, the conversations that we're having, they all went to school. How would the narrative have changed if any of those people were involved in conversations in classrooms that look like the ones that we're having here? How would that have changed the conversation in the narrative, right? Because there was so many opportunities for a disruptor to really disrupt that narrative and make sure that things were different, that it ended up differently somewhere along the line. But across the board, because of the stories that don't make it to the textbook, because of curriculum that's cookie cutter, because of conversations that aren't happening, what people are often exposed to is the single story stereotype and the white dominated narrative that demonizes everybody else. And so it's really easy for people to see someone like George Floyd as an aggressor, and easy for things like the Capitol Hill insurrection to happen, you know, and people to feel like some things are justified, or the conversation of Confederate statues coming down becomes a very politically charged one because people don't see how those are symbols of a history that we need to be really talking about in ways that we're not having those conversations. And so it makes me wonder, like, along the lines of just like how much of an impact can we have as schools if we're having these conversations? We are shaping reporters and police officers and lawyers and judges, and you know, these kids are going to occupy all of those important positions, and the future president could be sitting in my class today. You don't know, right? And how are these conversations going to really shape the future of our country when we have enough kids who are aware that history has never really been told the way it actually happened, and that we're able to like really shed light on that, and they can use that to change the status quo and to ensure that justice is at the forefront of all of their actions and all of their conversations moving forward, both as people in their personal lives, but also as professionals in their professional roles.
There's a lot to unpack there, and I'm glad that you're painting a picture, because I think when we're trying to revisit or think about here, let me go back. So when COVID happened, right, when our schools first shut down in March, was that 2 or 3 years? I can't even remember. That the time goes by so fast. I don't even know. But when COVID first happened, right, and then our schools shut down, I was really preaching on, like, this is the time for us to make changes. It's unfortunate that it takes tragedies to happen in order for people to try to make changes, or for people to be more aware and listen to these things that we've been talking about for years. And I was really hoping that, you know, we would start looking differently at how we do our assessments, how we assign our projects, and all these different things that are happening in our curriculum and instruction. And I saw a lot of changes, because when we came back to school in August, you know, we were still, a lot of us were still online or back and forth, hybrid, whatever it looked like. And now in 2022 in March, I'm starting to see us going. I mean, we're pretty much back to the way things were, and I really wished that things would have changed, but unfortunately, we're back to the status quo, and that's a challenge that I have with the way education is going. So let me ask you this, because one of the things that you mentioned in your response was, you know, again, a lot of kids, you get an assignment and it's just basically, I just want to get the assignment done so that I can get my A, so that I can pass my class, so I can get my GPA can stay up, or I can get ready for college and the next thing. But they don't necessarily, a lot of the assignments that we get, they don't necessarily connect the assignment with how that impacts them in the future. It's just more of, I got to get this work done. So like you said earlier, you're like, okay, I give out an assignment, and they say, Dr. Jabber, well, how many pages, what font, and you know, what's the topic, and boom, 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 they're done. And so I like your approach with creating opportunities for the students to take ownership in their learning. So I kind of want to shift gears a little bit and discuss the importance of student empowerment. Now, you mentioned that we're preparing our kids for outside of school, like when school is done, what are you going to do next? But what are some other things that you would probably suggest when it comes to the importance of having that student empowerment?
I mean, so it's a complete mind shift, because I think if I wanted to compare the way I was trained to be a teacher, right? It kind of defies all of that. And so I think student choice is really the biggest thing. Kids don't have a lot of choices in schools. We often make the choices for them. And so when you give them choices, they don't know what to do with it. And it's beyond what most teachers see as choice. Like, it's beyond a tic-tac-toe. Or here's a list of novels and you can pick your novel, like from a list, right? Or you're doing a persuasive paper and here's a list of topics, but you can pick from a topic. It's more than that. It's having the kids really think about what they want their learning to look like. I don't plan more than a week in advance. And even with my week in advance, I always tell the kids, like, I'm not married to anything. If we feel like we need to change things, I clearly have certain objectives that I'm trying to achieve. There's certain skills that kids need to know in 11th grade English. And I think that as an English teacher, especially, I have the flexibility of, kind of building those into a lot of different things in a lot of different ways. I can teach The Great Gatsby and Romeo and Juliet and Shakespeare, like, the way I learned. But I can also do that through elevating marginalized voices and getting the kids to really unpack, for example, Indigenous people's current events. Where are they now? Like, we talk about Indigenous people often like they're a history, like it's a past, like they've existed in the past that they no longer exist. And so we talk about where are Indigenous people now, and we kind of backtrace, like, how did we get here as a country and as a people? And so the kids find that conversation so much more compelling because it's in the world they're currently living in, right? We're not teaching it as something that they're completely detached from. And they see how decisions that we make here impact communities across our country, how we have the power to really impact some of those things. So I think really getting the kids to see their power, right? And it's not, I hate to use the word empowering students because it kind of connotes the idea that we have to give them that power and you still have the upper hand. As a teacher, and with many of our teachers being demographically different than our students, that creates a whole white saviorism mentality that I worry about. And so I think that it's creating spaces where students can take their power back, right? And giving them opportunities to really exercise that power in ways where they're interrogating things that matter in their lives and things that are going to help them kind of shift the status quo, right? And even if you're teaching, I know a lot of like teachers who teach in like primarily white schools are like, well, how does this conversation pertain to me? It pertains to those schools as just as much, if not more, because those students have to have an upper hand in really equalizing the playing field and understanding that their privilege affords them benefits that they've historically had that other kids don't have. And so they need to be collaborators and anti-racist in making sure that that work doesn't happen, that work is happening across the board. And so I think once the kids can see the value in the learning, oftentimes their voices are, if I ask the students for feedback at the end of every unit, I give the students a one-page reflection. And trust me, they're going to tell you what they think. They're going to tell you what they love, and they're going to tell you what they hate and what they don't enjoy. And one of the things that I do with my students is I actually take their feedback and I integrate it right back into the classroom. And I tell them, here's where I was able to really integrate your feedback. This is what things are going to look like. Obviously, there are certain things as a teacher that I have to keep in there because, like I said, there are certain standards and things and skills that I'm still trying to make sure that the kids are attaining through the classroom. But the choice that they have to choose how to showcase their learning. I don't do a lot of traditional testing in my classroom. They do things like create a podcast series throughout the year. So the students have to actually create their cover page, their title, they have to decide how they're going to format their podcasts. Their episodes, are they bringing in guests? Are they talking informally? What is the tone? Who's their audience for their podcast? And at the end of every single unit, they create a new episode for their podcast series, and they give their podcast series, a personality that's important to them, and they showcase topics that are important to them from every single unit. And in that way, my standards say I have to teach kids rhetoric. My standards say I have to focus on speaking and listening. My standards say that students have to be able to write, that they have to be able to to creatively write and research and write informatively. And they're doing all of those things in order to come up with content. They're writing scripts. They're researching information to find topics that are important to them and really delve deeply into those. They're interviewing people. They're speaking and listening by practicing their recordings until they're happy with what they've produced. They're listening to each other in order for them to have those conversations. They're using technology and outputs that are not traditional. So the skills that the kids are learning in a non-traditional assessment are much more world important, right? And beneficial to them in their college and career world. And they're not cookie cutter. than a paper and pencil test that I could be giving them that will ask them to answer questions or analyze a poem. And to get them to the point where they're creating these things, they're going through a whole bunch of other activities where they're engaging in critical conversations. They're reading high college level, peer edited research. They're reading just everything in order for them. But the idea is like, what's important to them? I have to figure out what matters to the kids that are sitting in front of me. And I teach 5 periods a day. That looks very different from one class to the other. Right? I'm not using the same curriculum with every group of kids because they're different. And so it takes a lot more work on the teacher side in order for you to prepare for the class. But once you're in the classroom, you're a facilitator and the kids are leading the work. And so it's a trade-off. Whereas historically, you're doing all the work and you're the center of the classroom, the students are the center of the classroom, and you're doing some of that prep work in the background. And it's so much more rewarding. And I think the beauty of seeing the lights go off and the gears turning for some of these kids, and I'm not tooting my own horn, but I mean,
Teacher of the year, by the way. Sorry, can I throw that out there? Oh, my bad. Sorry, you're not tooting your own horn. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut you off. So
I'm not tooting my own horn, but like kids will come and say like, this class is so different than any other class, and I've learned so much here, and I've grown so much here, or I've decided to be a teacher because I want to do the same thing for my students, or I really have found myself here. So I hear that all the time with high school kids. This is the highlight of my day. Kids in my classroom journal every single day. I think it's a really, really important thing for kids to have a place to process the world. And they're not required to talk about things that are happening in classroom. One of the things that I tell them is like, if there's something happening in your life right now that you want me to know, use a sentence stem, I wish my teacher knew, and just write. And so once we build this culture of trust, my classroom becomes a place of critical conversation, but it's also a place of healing. It's a place where kids feel like they can talk to me about things that are happening at home because they're not ready to bring their whole self into the classroom or their best self into the classroom that day. And that's perfectly fine because I understand that they're human, right? And so we take Shane Saphir's idea that, we have to really stop viewing kids as kind of like standardized test scores, but really take this concept of holism and understand everything that shapes a student and their learning, and really understand that bring the humanity back into our classrooms, and understand that we're in a business of shaping humans, right? That's what we do. And so that's it's a chemistry of so many things. And if we expect kids to come into today more than ever post-COVID, our classrooms just ready to learn, that's a flawed expectation, and you're going to lose a lot of kids from the very beginning. Or you're going to end up with kids who know how to do school well, but they're not going to remember what you taught them once your year is over. And I want the kids to reflect back in my classroom 10 years from now, 15 years from now, when they're adults talking to their own children, and say, I remember when we had that experience. Because when they walk into my classroom, they're not coming in here to learn. They're coming in here to have experiences that are going to shape them as people and prepare them for a world outside. That's a tough world.
Let me ask you this question, because I've been following the news a little bit, and I try, sometimes I turn it on and off. I have my spurts, sometimes I start watching the news and it just gets to a place I'm like, man, forget this, and I'll turn it off. And then other times I'll try to keep my eye on it to see what's going on, especially when they start talking about education. And there's a lot of there's a lot of states that are looking to pass laws which will require teachers to have to submit their entire year's worth of lesson plans, and that gets to be reviewed and all these things. And as I listen to the way that you do your classroom and the way that you work with your students when it comes to lesson plan, I mean, you said I plan about a week in advance. Now I'm assuming you probably have some units and you probably have some ideas of what that could look like, but overall, as far as what the details of those lesson plans, you're probably only a week or so ahead. And how do you think, if these laws are passed, let's say in your home state, a law that's passed that says, hey, you need to produce your whole school year's worth of content before August or before we start up, how do you think that's going to impact the way that you teach? And not just you, but other educators that are very similar, where it's like, I cater my experience, my classroom experience, based off of the students that are in my room. But if I got to produce this over the summer and I don't even know what my roster looks like, I don't even know who's in my class, what do you think that might, or how do you think that might impact you and your professional career as far as a teacher with the way that you do your planning?
So we know that those laws are being passed in order to curb the equity conversation, because it's a scary, impactful conversation that's happening. And it's really weaponizing critical race theory in ways that are just kind of shutting down equity work across the board and conversations of equity. That's the real kind of intent behind all of that. And at the end of the day, I think my conversation with teachers who are working in schools, like I've worked in schools where the school itself wasn't ready and the leadership wasn't ready for equity work to be happening, despite the fact that demographics in those districts were changing quickly and drastically. And my advice to those teachers is, yes, it's going to change things for sure. Like, you're not going to be able, there's a lot of things that if I was the receiver of a law or if I had to do that, then it would definitely change a lot of things for me in my classroom. But even within the constraints, if we are really devoted to the work as anti-racist teachers, and we are really devoted to getting students to understand a lot of the things that are happening, there's always a loophole, right? And it's kind of your job to understand in your district find that loophole and walk through it. And so I always tell my students, you are content creators. Like, what they produce is something that we learn from. So when we study poetry, we read one and we write one. And when the kids write their poetry, we analyze their poetry like we would analyze the poetry of a poet that we're reading that's a published poet, because their writing is just as valuable. And that's one of the ways that we really get to share the lived experiences of the demographics that are represented in our classroom. No law is going to come in and tell you that you're going to have to censor your students, right? We have to censor what we bring into the classroom, but the students can bring in whatever they want. And so I would say, within the constraints of planning in advance, really think about, like, how can you create lessons that are flexible, that allow your students to really create the content? How can you shape lessons that really allow your students to bring in identity? Including students has never been, seeing students and including students. Principal Baruti Kafili said, like, that's not race, that's not politics, even though the idea of not bringing politics into the classroom, and people saying, like, schools aren't places of politics. You know how I feel. I always say it, like, when we're making decisions not to bring in certain voices, that's a political decision. So schools are very political, whether we like to admit it or not. We're playing with politics when we're deciding whose voices to bring in and whose voices to keep out. But the idea of, like, nobody's going to mark that as something that's inappropriate when you're saying, I want my student to be able to bring their whole self in here, and I want my students to be able to I want to create opportunities for my kids to really tell a good story and their own life story, right? And then your kids' lived experiences become the content that you're really studying in the classroom. And just by amplifying CRT, one big component of critical race theory is counter storytelling, right? And that's such a powerful tool by itself. If we do nothing but create space where kids from different backgrounds can really share their own stories with fidelity and bring their whole selves into the classroom, you're doing equity work in a classroom, because you're empowering students to love themselves, love who they are, share themselves. They're creating mirrors of themselves, right? And by creating mirrors of their individual selves, other students are seeing windows into the lives and actual stories of people in their classroom, and they're learning from those too. And that human piece is what's going to dismantle stereotypes, right? I find that with a lot of people, and I've shared this story before. I don't know if I've shared it on the podcast or not, but, like, I had a student in a school that I was working in who came in and said, my dad says you're a terrorist, and I know that what he said was kind of like the elephant in the room for a lot of the students in the classroom. And when we had the opportunity to, I was like, okay, this can go a lot of ways. I can give him a referral and send him to the dean, or I can sit down and I can address this issue and really see what the core of this kind of, like, label where does it come from? And so we sat down and we talked about it in front of the class. And I said, okay, let's try to figure out where that comes from. We spent 2 days talking, and at the end of it, we came to the conclusion that we fear what we don't understand. And so I said, okay, now you fear what you don't understand. What do you want to know about me? Let's work on, you understanding me better. And so ask me anything. And at the end of that 2-3 days, and I always tell my students, go back and share with your parents, because that's kind of like paying it forward. The father called me and apologized. Yeah. They had never interacted with anybody who looked like me before. And so a lot of that kind of the silos that we live in, the segregation as a country, we're more segregated than we were in the 60s. And so that segregation automatically causes people to not understand other groups of people, to kind of take in as truth what they see on the media and on the news. And so I always say, like, just by sheer interaction, a human interaction, by me sharing my stories and telling people who I am, I'm dismantling stereotypes of what Arab Muslim women look like. There's not a lot of Muslim kids in my current school. And when the kids sit down to share and journal, I sit down to share and journal as well. And a big part of that is making myself vulnerable, but also helping students to understand that what they see about people who look like me on the news isn't actually true. And I get a lot of students who are like really surprised about some of the things that they hear, and really surprised at the fact that they can relate to me in a lot of ways that they never thought they could have, but also that, you know, you're a real person too. It makes you more accessible, but it also makes the conversation more real, and it makes them more willing to engage in the conversation because they see you modeling that in the classroom. And so again, those mirrors and windows are equity work without calling it equity work. And so even in places where there's like a big taboo of saying things like culturally responsive teaching, or let's really get to like what's missing from the history books, or let's talk about intersectionality, you can't say those words explicitly, but you can do that work through the students and having students kind of bring themselves into the classroom. And that's within your locus of control.
I think these days we're just so tied up on semantics, and it's really deflecting away from the work that needs to be done. I think at the end of the day, we can all agree we want the best for our students, whatever side you're on or whatever you're at, or whatever news station you watch, right? We could all agree that we want the best for our students, and to me, that's the bottom line. And I love talking to you about the stuff that you're doing in your classroom and the work that you do. I think it's amazing, and I think Teacher of the Year award is much deserved. So I'm very happy for you for that. Let's wrap things up. And folks, if you have some questions, get those ready, because you can start popping those questions in right now. If you have anything that we haven't discussed that you would like to have addressed, especially if you're an English teacher, or if you're looking to try to reframe the way that you are doing your curriculum and instruction, your pedagogy, as far as, trying to shift away from the traditional standpoint of what education has always looked like. And I'll just say from the Industrial Revolution all the way until today, which is very similar to what it was like back in those times. So if you have those questions, go ahead and start popping those in. Now, Sawsan, it's always a pleasure to have you. I consider you as providing a voice in leading equity. Why don't you wrap things up with your final thoughts?
I'm just going to comment on your last comment, and not just especially if you're an English teacher, because I think a lot of teachers think that this work like fits more comfortably in humanities classrooms. But if you're a science teacher, if you're a math teacher, if you are an economics teacher, like, and listening to Clint Smith, I think, or the 1619 Project, like, there's contributions of minoritized groups in our country. This country is a country that's really built on the contributions of, education as we know it, algebra, math, the sciences. Like, there's contributions of people who have been hidden historically. And so this work really does live in every content area. And I can't imagine a teacher teaching anything without getting to know kids first, right? Like, really getting to know kids. And I think by really getting to know kids, like, I think journaling can happen in any subject, right? Journaling is something that, starting out the day, if we're talking about meeting students' social and emotional needs today, especially, and I think that's at the forefront of conversation post-COVID, what are some ways that you can really meet your students' social emotional needs as a math teacher, right? When kids aren't really, where the curriculum doesn't lend itself to kids talking about how they feel or their experiences that they're having. Journaling is a great way to start. Like 5 minutes, 7 minutes at the beginning of the class period, jot down your thoughts, and it becomes a private conversation that you get to have with every single student in your classroom at the end of the week or during the week. And so I think that we have to really shift our thinking. Part of that reframing our classroom is to also think about, how does this work live and look like in a math classroom, in a science classroom, in every classroom, in an elementary school classroom, in a college setting. It has a home everywhere. And we really need to be intentional about elevating the voices and elevating the contributions of people in the subjects that we are studying across the board, in order for us to kind of show and humanize groups that have been vilified and really flattened, I think, right? Like that flat history of many groups of people that people don't understand and celebrate the contributions and the joy that exists alongside the history and the pain that's there as well. And so I think we have to really shift the idea that this sits in one space and understand that it is in every system, in every office, in every department, in every curriculum, in every lesson plan. That in order for us, we can't think about school and not really center equity at the forefront in every part of it.
Mm. Yeah. And that, I think that's key. And I appreciate those closing thoughts. And thank you for extending it, not just to our humanities, but also to those who are in education as well. And I totally agree with that. If we have some folks that want to connect with you, what are the best way to reach out?
I think Twitter is like at SJ Educate. That's where the conversations are happening. That's where I get my news. I don't watch the news anymore. I know some leading voices kind of like in areas that I want to follow, and that's where you'll find me tweeting things that are happening, retweeting other awesome people and the work that they're doing, and probably the most active there. So at SJ Educate is where you can find me if you want to find me.
All right. Well, I don't see any questions pop up in the comments. So make sure that you're following Sawsan. If you're not following her, please do so. I mean, she also always has some awesome thoughts. So please make sure you're reaching out to her. And if they want to send you an email, what's the best way to connect?
Educationunfiltered@gmail.com.
All right, there we go. Well, Sawsan, it's always a pleasure. I appreciate you. Thank you so much for spending a day at school and then jumping right on a live stream with me. I do appreciate that. That means a lot. So I appreciate you for making this work out.
Sheldon, you're not my BFF for nothing, right? I'm always ready to engage in a conversation with you any day, anytime. Always awesome.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, take care. I appreciate you so much. All right. Well, we're going to wrap things up. So I'm just going to end this with this a few thoughts here. And I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off like that, Sawsan. But we need to rethink the way that we're doing our education. And again, I thought COVID was an opportunity for us to make some changes, but I'm starting to see stuff happening again, kind of going back into where we were at before. So I really appreciate those who were able to log on. Please make sure, if you aren't already, follow us on, follow me on Twitter, Sheldon L. Akins. Follow me on Instagram, Sheldon Akins. And then remember, Akins is spelled with an E-A-K-I-N-S. Make sure that you're subscribed to our YouTube channel and also Facebook if you're not following, so that way you can get notified. We're here every Thursday. So make sure that you do so. Remember the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. If you can't fly, then run. If you can't run, then walk. If you can't walk, then crawl. But by all means, keep moving. Let's continue to be a voice in leading equity.